Okay, good evening or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. Welcome, welcome. I'm Dan Winter. This is fractalu.com, and it's December 6th. And today's course is on the deep science of bliss and ecstasy and peak perception. And we are going to be talking a bit about Kundalini and the physiology of bliss and Kundalini. And we're basing a lot of this on material that's on the web link at fractalfield.com/conjugate perception, which is a theory of perception based on implosion, fractality, phase conjugation, centripetal forces, essentially. It includes frequency signatures and some detailed physics. So the first thing that, in a conversation about bliss and peak perception, it's pretty easy to get abstract about these things. And I thought we'd start. I was going to imagine that somebody had asked me, do I have a right to talk about bliss? And, is bliss and peak experience part of my own experience? And really, in a way, in order to make this personal, it's appropriate that maybe we start. I'm going to tell sort of a little bit of a story about how I tripped over some of these experiences. Actually, I learned years ago when I taught physics of consciousness around the world for many years, and whenever we had an audience of scientists, which I really enjoyed, I would always try to ask the scientist, who in this room has had a bliss experience? And you could almost divide the room in two, and you could almost divide the room into between those scientists who had had a bliss experience and those who had not. And those who had had a bliss experience would be fundamentally had a little different orientation to the science. So it really does sort of, in many cases, it becomes a turning point in your life when you have a bliss experience. And everyone has their own way of approaching these things. And, we're going to talk about the science, and that is my focus. But to make that personal, I was going to do a little bit of the personal background here. So when I was a kid, you see, my grandfather had started a business in Buffalo, New York. It was electric motor repair and electric repair shop, basically. And as a kid, as a teenager, I was working in the motor repair shop, doing electric repair of just about everything. And so I was sort of like Sparky the motor guy, and everything was an electrical metaphor for me from a very early age. I was born at an early age, and my brother was an only child. I'll stop with the jokes now. So then, sort of a long story, but I ended up going to the university where my uncle had been in electrical engineering. I was sort of a nerd in high school, but as I came from high school, I got lucky and I was kind of smart. So I had scholarships and invitations to a lot of very high-end universities, MIT, Clarkson, it was good for the ego, I suppose. But I ended up going to the University of Detroit, electrical engineering, where I was offered major scholarship help by GM, actually, it was a wonderful thing, and studied with the Jesuits in a monastery garden, interdisciplinary, everything. That was the University of Detroit for me. Psychoanalysis of literature along with electrical engineering. It was pretty interdisciplinary, and that was therapeutic. And by the way, I did I was playing music as part of in fact, I was part of the Singing Titans. Anyway, the excuse was that if you wanted to remain sane while you're studying electrical engineering, you do music, and I did, and it was cool. But to make the short story long, I ended up attracted in the electrical studies to the psychophysiology section. Actually, what happened was there was a professor there named Albert X, who was one of the inventors of the concept of biofeedback, along with Elmer Green. And Albert X was famous for electrically differentiating fear and anger. Now, that was my thing. I was into deeply thinking about the electrical nature of emotion. That was my, yes, I was studying electrical engineering, but I was interested in the electrical engineering of people. So I began I did, I guess you could say, undergraduate and graduate work as a builder in the polygraph clinic of the psychophysiology lab, where we were doing things like biofeedback for hypertension and headaches and high blood pressure and things like that. And in that biofeedback lab, the polygraph there was the one which had been used in that famous first study with Albert Axe, who was my mentor, to electrically discriminate fear and anger. And he had, welcome, Wayne. So Professor Axe had been able to tell the difference between fear and anger in just electrical language by measuring 8 psychophysiological variables. Notable among them was, of course, GSR, galvanic skin response. I'll never forget how impressed I was when you could take a healthy college male with lots of testosterone and how fast his GSR, little strip chart of his finger resistance, would go off the charts when you showed him a certain picture out of Playboy magazine. It was very impressive to me. I was like, oh, well, let's see, the resistance goes down. This is permission to touch. And the other thing about permission to touch measure is something called vasoconstriction, vasodilation, which basically is that when you have the urge to touch, the blood goes to the surface. So if your lover, the joke was, if your lover touches you or you touch your lover and the skin turns pink, her blood is saying, yes, I'm coming out to touch you. But on the other hand, if you have the cold hands sort of experience, it means vasoconstriction, which means blood to core instead of blood to periphery. And that means I'm not wanting to touch you. And this it introduces a fun conversation from the thing called The Order of the Red Hand, a famous book in the series of William Butler Yeats, I believe, in which the skill on how to vasodilate, which is to say to be soft and have the blood to the surface, is more and more forgotten in the West, where we become hypertensive. Remember, the psychophysiology lab in which I was working was doing hypertension therapy. That's what we were doing, high blood pressure, people who did not know how to vasodilate. And that is related to the metaphor of an ice skater who, when she pulls in her arms, the inertia and the blood goes to core, that's vasoconstriction, and speeds up. The ice skater, when she's spinning and she pulls her arms in, she speeds up. Whereas if the ice skater releases her arms outward, then the spin slows down, and that's vasodilation, the blood to the periphery. And that it makes a big difference in terms of spin density in the body as well, and we'll look at that metaphor a little later. But that leads you to the idea of the electrical difference between fight and flight. Obviously, if you're going to fight, you need your blood to the surface because you have to. Whereas if you're going to run, flight, then more often you have your blood to the core because you want to be more like a bullet than an umbrella. And the fight-flight response is central to the electrical difference between fear and anger. And there was a famous study published in, I think it was Scientific American magazine, where they were just studying the difference between fight and flight response in dogs. And in terms of the psychophysiology of emotion. And what they concluded was that, in fact, they used the fight-flight response in dogs to illustrate what was at that time famously called catastrophe theory. Catastrophe theory was this idea that if you had a stressor that was moving against a rubber band, a variable resistance, that at a certain point, the geometry would require a change of state where it would snap from one state to another. And there's a way of modeling this with rubber bands and cogs. It's called a discontinuity from a continuity. It's catastrophe theory. And this is really behind the idea of quantum mechanics. How can you have discontinuity from continuity? From continuous wave mechanics, you in fact have wave packets that are quantized. Why are they quantized into little packets of waves instead of being continuous? They are discontinuous. And this is a philosophy of science kind of question. But so this led to the catastrophe theory discussions in mathematical modeling. And the theory of emotion was used to understand catastrophe theory, and they used emotion in dogs. So why did they use change of state of emotion in a dog to model this catastrophe theory? Well, it's interesting to think about because, you see, you know, if you're approaching a dog and if the dog is in the anger mode, it's going to be much harder to have the dog move toward the flight mode, you know, from fear to anger and back, from fight to flight and back. The reason it's such a quantum leap between fear and anger from fight and flight in dogs, it was explained in the article in Scientific American, that the glandular chemistry has momentum in the body. In other words, if the dog gets all the juices going inside his body, which are involved with fight and anger, switching those juices to flight and fear is a major catastrophe. It's a quantum leap. It's the snap of the rubber band, as it were. And so this is a very discrete electrical difference between fear and anger, fight and flight, which is behind the kinds of things we were doing in graduate school many years ago. So that's just a little background for how I began to think about the electrical nature of emotion. So you can imagine later when I began to start having these Kundalini experiences, rather than being diagnosed nuts, I mean insane, instead it was more interesting to discuss it in psychophysiological terms. So how did I come to start having Kundalini experiences? In other words, where was my bliss? So let me tell you how that happened. Let me say that how that did happen involved my mother being quite certain that I had fallen off the deep end and gone nuts. We see, after graduation, I began doing graduate work in psychophysiology. But then at a certain point, when the graduate work in psychophysiology, the scholarship part of that ran out, and I said, well, maybe I need to look for a job. And I got a job as a systems analyst with IBM. How did that happen? Incredible luck, good karma, whatever. And IBM training is some of the best in the world. That was very cool. I was trained in Detroit and Chicago and Poughkeepsie. I was only there for about a year, but boy, it was an excellent, excellent training. But the point at which my mother decided that I had gone certifiably insane was when I decided I was going to quit my job as a systems analyst with IBM. Now, if you're an American red-blooded something or other and you have a job at IBM and the fringe benefits alone are like, you know, in those days. So quitting a job at IBM is pretty much evidence of insanity, and that's what I did in order to go to the Gurdjieff School. Now, why did I choose the Gurdjieff School? It was Claymont.org in West Virginia. And I had been studying basically musical theory and harmonics as it relates to spiritual experience at the time. Remember, we were doing a lot of psychoanalysis of literature and philosophy of religion and studied Nietzsche. And, you know, I got a pretty good dose of interdisciplinary whatever from the Jesuits. So I was into the esoteric nature of things. And for me at that point, Gurdjieff was like, you know, got to check this out. So instead of doing the sensible thing, I went to the Gurdjieff School, and there we did something called the sacred gymnastic, and I actually became the musician for the sacred gymnastics in the Gurdjieff School. And during the sacred gymnastics, if you watch Meetings with Remarkable Men, the famous film, for example, you see at the end that the actual movements of the sacred gymnastic are such that there's a palpable electric field generated in the room. You have this thing called forming twos, where you do these octaves with your hand and then your head, and you actually have 6 different octaves, harmonics going at once in your body, and your attention has to phase lock the spin relationships of one arm moving at frequency X and the other arm moving at frequency Y. And then the head is moving at frequency Z. And so X over 2, Y over 2, and Z over 2, 2, 4, 6, 8 harmonics are present in your own body, and the discipline required to hold these disparate frequencies together in your attention at once increases with practice, and you're able to then phase lock more harmonics in your attention. Let me just say, again, to make a long story short, that after some months of doing the sacred gymnastic, I began to have Bliss and Kundalini experiences. I began to break out in tears when I would join these groups. We were doing Sufi dances. Also, many of you know that Gurdjieff was inspired by the Sufi. We had Rashad Field, who wrote The Last Barrier in the Sufi tradition, there with us in the Gurdjieff school. Came to know him, and I then actually was very active with the Sufi Healing Order, and years later I sponsored Sufi dance conferences with Saul Baradowski of the Sufi Healing Order and Neil Douglas Klotz and the Sufi Order, who wrote Aramaic translation of the Lord's Prayer. And I was involved with the Sufi Order famously in New York, and that group was part of our conferences in Florence, Italy. So it was a lifetime involvement with the Sufis at that point, and that's sort of another story. Our friend Vincent said that the Sufis are the ones who saved him when he was doing rituals in Cairo. So I started to have these experiences. Now remember, we're trying to distill from this what is the basic physiology of Kundalini and Bliss, and I'm going to use the metaphor here of charge acquisition, ability to implode charge, in the sense of Celestine prophecy saying all human interaction is about charge, where we're using what would then be a scientific term for what in religious tradition is called Chi, Orgone, Baraka, Shaktipat, Spirit, Grace. We have all these terms. I think using electrical language is helpful because it enables more discipline in the conversation, and also hopefully eliminates the need for religion wars because we have a common language, science, physics. And then hopefully can add to the beauty of the description of Bliss process. So there I was in the Gurdjieff school, and I'm a double Scorpio. Lots of sting and lots of repressed energy. I'm sure I was functionally a virgin at that point, and a lot of repressed chi, I'm sure. And I was coming from Detroit University, where, when you're in university, you kind of eat not such good food. Whereas in the Gurdjieff community, there we were, the big garden, and it was natural food, everything, and you were having oatmeal and fresh for breakfast. And it was what they call a Zen diet. And so it was my first experience with spiritual discipline. And I guess in retrospect, I would say as well that Kundalini happens mostly to those whose nervous system has evolved to a critical mass of centripetal force. And we're about to have a conversation about what are the physiologic correlates of Kundalini. And that's the next part of this conversation this evening. But first, let me say that after the Gurdjieff school, somehow I ended up kind of being adopted in a certain way by Ben Bentoff, Itzhak Bentoff, who famously wrote the book Stalking the Wild Pendulum on the biomechanics of Kundalini. Actually, what I was doing is I was the Forrest Gump of the physics of consciousness generation. That's why, in order to play that role, Tom Hanks, eat your heart out, I was going to all the physics of consciousness symposia of the day. And we had some fabulous times at the Physics of Consciousness Symposia in Toronto there. I remember Ava Reich was there, and I met Bill Tiller, came to know him fairly well many years ago, and of course Bentoff. And Marcel Vogel was a friend at that time, and Arthur Young. So when did I meet Nick? Nick Fiorenza? So I sort of was lucky. I was adopted by a lot of the people who were Henry Evering, I remember, in Toronto, and became involved in psychotronics. So long story, I kind of got to know all those people. And I was taught by all those people. And later I was taught personally by Buckminster Fuller at some length, actually. So, Nick Herbert. Yes, Nick Herbert, we met in, I think it was Santa Cruz. He was a character even back then. He was rebellious and crotchety. We had fun. Yeah, no, I had lived in Santa Cruz, actually, Felton, California, and we were actually. I was staying at that point with Murphy, who founded Esalen. And yeah, it just seemed in those days that every time I turned around, I was being adopted by somebody who was leading the New Age movement. So, even, who was it, Taking the Quantum Leap, Fred Wolf, we spent some time with him. And oh, God, yes, those were the days. So, Science of Bliss. So then I began to form of some very specific physiologic ideas about what bliss and Kundalini were, and a lot of that was truly from my own experience. And so Bentov had formed a theory, a model of how Kundalini worked, which I think we might actually look at right now. Bentov said, let's see if I can find that slide here. So we're on page 4 right now. I'm going to page 16. Bear with me one moment. No, that's not the slide I wanted. Just bear with me one second here. So basically, Ben had built in his laboratory south of Boston, and I lived with a Gurdjieff community in Marshfield, Massachusetts at that time called Windfall. And we were doing sacred gymnastic, and I was also rather adopted by a physicist at MIT named John Richardson, who helped me do my first computer graphics modeling implosion, actually at MIT. And right in that area, Bentov's home, he invited me miraculously, and I don't know why, but he did. And, oh yes, here's what I'm looking for. Here's the picture. Let me just zoom in here. Now we're talking about Bentov's model of what Kundalini is psychophysiologically and how he measured it. So this is his model and his drawing, but I need to explain a little bit about how he got there. He built a capacitive accelerometer, which was my specialty in biofeedback. And a capacitive accelerometer essentially uses the plates of a capacitor just above and below the body, and the body then becomes a dielectric variable insulator between the plates of the capacitor. And tiny changes in the capacitance is a measure of what's called micromotion entrainment. And micromotion is the Kundalini physiology analog to what in pyramid science is called infrasound. So if you have phonon low-frequency interferometry, that's phase conjugate, that is implosive, that's conjugation being the climax form of coherence, you get a form of concentration, plasma containment of the holding to center of charge density. And holding to center of charge density is a perfect introduction to what Kundalini is. At any rate, when you were seated in Bentov's very special chair, and, in those days, having a polygraph to record the screen, you used a Polaroid camera. That's how those were the days. And so he did screen recordings, which proved that he could measure the low frequencies of the spine liquid pump, like a serpent on its tail, as it were. And he could measure that phase and train the ventricles of the brain cavity right here in this slide. And so actually the ventricles are here. These are the ventricle horns. This is the liquid. And he measured the frequencies coming up the spine liquid pump, which later we came to know as the sacrocranial pump literature. And we're going to look at a slide now of those frequencies. And he proved that they would phase lock the ventricle cavities of the brain, your ventricle horns. And this was conserved sexual energy, it was, and you would then get horny. And literally the ventricle horns would become more pointed because of the phonon coherence that would build. And there would be an ultraviolet coherence, and this was your blue fire, this was your sex juice. So there's a lot about Kundalini, Tantra, and sex in this kind of physics. Now, elsewhere in my new book, you will find a table. It's not in the slides tonight, but it's a table that Bentov published where he measured the ringing in the ears heard by meditators And my partner Valerie says she knows which of her ancestors is calling by which ear is ringing. Introduction to the physics of clairaudience related to the possibility of Kundalini. The ringing in your ear is a climax phenomena, and the ringing in your ear is basically your DNA imploding and your phonon sacrocranial imploding, and all of that creates a lightning form of charge density at center, which is mitogenic radiation, DNA radio. It's the radio to the collective unconscious. That's what it is. It's beautiful, and it's physics. So here then is the chart from Bentov. Let's see if I can move down here, right here. These are the frequencies on the frequencies here in red from the sacrocranial literature of what the low frequencies of the spine liquid pump are. And they're called the tidal frequencies, and they're much longer wave than breath and heart. So here you see in red the, oh, I'm sorry, no, let me get straight, no. The frequencies in green are the tidal frequencies of the Kundalini. The frequencies in red are the actual equation from my book. Just 1 second. Sorry about this one. Oh, I unplugged the phone. I apologize for that. So the point being here that if you calculate the frequencies, which is the subject of my book and this whole series, which is Planck length and time times exact integer golden ratio exponents of Planck length and time, called phase conjugation, you get a caduceus cascade which predicts the frequencies of photosynthesis, Earth year, Venus year, brainwave harmonics, and all phase conjugate negentropic collapse, the origin of all biologic negentropy. And that is that cascade, that harmonic cascade in 3D is literally a wave fractal, and in my view, the definition of fractality in space and time, and the enabled possibility of infinite non-destructive compression. And actually, you know, in fractality, pure mathematic fractality, the compression is infinite. But in my model, the fractality is perfect, radiating from Planck length and time, but at the resolution of Planck length and time, the compression is not infinite. There's a translation of vorticity there, where in that caduceus, and you can look down, this is a caduceus picture here. In that caduceus, the rotary component, which you could think of as a transverse component of the wave, when it rotates down that spiral down the pine cone. Remember, phase conjugation is pine cones kissing noses. So as that inertia of transverse rotation, the transverse wave, is rotated down the pine cone, when it reaches the resolution of the quantum foam, called Planck length and time, the musical key signature of all of matter, that the rotary component is translated in perfect non-destructive compression, called optimized translation of vorticity, the definition of golden mean spiral in hydrodynamics. What's translated in vorticity perfectly without loss of inertia is the rotational component to the linear component. You could say, quite literally, matter is rotation, charge, rotation, energy, charge in a line. In this case, the rotational component is the transverse wave, and the linear component squirting out the end through through the nozzle of the squirt gun, as it were, being the Planck length. What's squirted out there is a longitudinal component called longitudinal electromagnetics, sometimes incorrectly labeled scalar or torsional. And the longitudinal EMF is proven to be superluminal, faster than light, and will go through just about anything. Hint, hint, the mind of God, how DNA radio propagates, the spiritual literature, everywhere at onceness, and specifically action at a distance. Because if you interfere these longitudinal components at a distance, they then reconverge, conjugate back transverse from longitudinal, and then again produce heat at a distance. We talked about this many times. The physics of the Russian woodpecker, the Tom Bearden story, the interferometry, which was the Foo Fighters in the World War II story, these plasma balls that are manipulated from a distance, and Luke Skywalker's sword famously, etc. So plasma containment at a distance, we said the way Ingo Swann heated the thermistor with his mind at a distance in a Faraday cage. The only physics that accounts for this is his mind was producing a longitudinal wave, and the way his mind was doing that was this same frequency cascade. Phase conjugation, pine cones kissing noses, is how you make longitudinal waves, these compressional waves, which compress right down to center, which we now know is the wave mechanic of healing devices like Lukovsky, Priory, and Therify. It's the production of the longitudinal components. Because, look, the transverse waves, when they meet, they're not going to produce the perfect squeeze. But if you cause the longitudinal waves to meet accurately at a distance, they can produce the perfect squeeze. The implosive compression and perfected compression is, in all cases, in my view, the solution to every mystery in physics and in spirituality and in psychology. Any mystery you got, alchemy, the way through death, transmutation, fusion energy, plasma physics, any problem you got, what is the answer? Non-destructive compression, infinite compression. You asked Einstein, you said, well, how are we going to find the unified field? And Einstein said, infinite non-destructive compression. So if you understood perfected compression, you have the answer to just about every mystery that you can think of. How to design the perfect city, how to build a Stargate, how to take your bliss through death. It's all about infinite non-destructive compression, because it's how energy moves non-destructively to compress energy and information. And that is the essence of information density. It's the essence of the history of computing. You know, what is the history of computing? Oh, it is the discovery of non-destructive electrical compression. So all mysteries, we got the same answer. Isn't that convenient? So the idea is, if we understood what a fractal field was, yes. So where this conversation is supposed to go next is the story of the brainwave map of bliss and peak perception. So here we see that not just, before we leave this slide, we see that not just the sacrocranial low frequencies are a phase conjugate pump wave. And in the next course on heart coherence and HRV coherence, we hopefully will have with us our heart rate variability, our sacrocranial professional, said phoneme. Let me get a link here. So the person writing our code, oh yes, here we are, said phoneme, I'm finding it. Person writing our code for our new version of the Heart's Ring, in my view, a world expert on low-frequency sacrocranial and sacrocranial therapy, Patrick Botti from Belgium, will be joining us for that advanced course on heart coherence, HRV, and heart biofeedback. And that course will have as our guest Patrick Botti, who will be talking in more depth about the sacrocranial pump. But just to say, the low frequencies of the sacrocranial do appear to be the key wave mechanics of Tantra, Kundalini, Bliss, sacrocranial therapy, and to hear Upledger's School of Sacrocranial in Florida tell it, they say that if your spine liquid, I'm doing my spine liquid pump now, if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. So basically, spine liquid pump is an essential solution to depression. So we wanted to show here the other slide. And I got my gain. Oh yes, I'm doing good here. I'm learning how to use the gadget. This is a map of the heart low frequencies, HF and LF. And it is widely known that remember, heart rate variability is the hottest subject in medicine today. We talk about that in our course on heart coherence. And measuring heart rate variability is a way to teach empathy. Heartsring.com, which will soon be our new version with Patrick, and the new version will include sacrocranial biofeedback. And the way that includes sacrocranial biofeedback is with the new knowledge that the LF-HF components right here of the low frequencies of the heart, the HRV, are in fact quite literally, here is the Meyer wave. The Meyer wave is a very famous low-frequency wave mechanic of the relationship of blood pressure in the body to its natural internal resonance at 0.1 hertz. And guess what my equation calls for from Planck and pure phase conjugate collapse? 0.0959 hertz. In other words, the Meyer wave, which is the LF of heart rate variability, is exactly a phase conjugate collapse wave. And so too is the HF wave. Both the HF and LF frequency centers of the classic perfect heart rate variability, HRV, HF, and LF, turn out to be at the frequencies of phase conjugate negentropic collapse, the equation on the cover of my book. So the spine liquid pump is doing the same dance that we're about to see the brain do, phase conjugate implosive collapse. And collectively, what's that doing is tightening the lightning bolt up the spine, the so-called Kundalini and Bliss wave mechanic. And that is what I felt. I did feel the classic Kundalini. I felt it was like a lightning bolt, a red hot poker coming up your tailbone and eventually igniting and going out so the top of your head feels like a burning torch for months at a time. And I have that experience, had it for many years, and learned with great trauma how to survive that, really. And yes, I suppose swimming is excellent for spine liquid pump, so that is the point. But as is pointed out in the literature in Bentoff's Stalking the Wild Pendulum, that unfortunately Kundalini, and to some extent Bliss, is most frequently medically diagnosed as schizophrenia. And that is a tragedy that we're here to fix. It is not that schizophrenia is not a real and very traumatic condition, but Kundalini can be discriminated from schizophrenia and should be. And incidentally, my graduate mentor, Professor Albert Axe at University of Detroit, was the other thing that he spent his career on was the brain chemistry to differentiate schizophrenia. In one way, oversimplistically, we could think about schizophrenia as basically more than one plasma entity inhabiting your body at once. I'm hearing voices. Well, guess what? When you have Kundalini, you probably are going to hear voices, and I did. And medically, that would be a definition of insanity, and feel free to call me insane if you like. But if you study the physics here, you understand actually where and when and how the voices are coming from. And when you understand that, suddenly, you don't need to call it insanity. You can call it physics. The bumper sticker that goes with this conversation is the little old lady driving down the road. Her bumper sticker says, "I don't suffer from insanity. I enjoy it." So we Scorpios, we don't apologize for Sting. We enjoy it. And enjoying Sting is a pretty good introduction to Kundalini. Actually, I came to know and have some connection with Gopi Krishna with his book on Kundalini, because he was a friend of whom I worked with at that time, Human Dimensions Institute, Jean Ringe, who then introduced me to Gopi Krishna. I met Arthur Young through her. So Gopi Krishna's book on Kundalini is basically what I call the crybaby effect. He spends half the book saying, "Oh, it's killing me, it's killing me." He prayed to God that it would go away. And this is basically Krishnamurti's response to Kundalini also. In my view, this is not mature. Actually, Kundalini is extreme charge density up the spine liquid pump, which has a powerful microwave component, and it is something that you can deal with intelligently if you understand the electrical physics. And I would honor the ancient literature. I know there's a lot in the Vedic literature, of course, on this, and I'm only qualified to touch the surface of that. But I strongly suggest that it is possible to actually do a dictionary to correlate the ancient Vedic terms for these things to serious electrical engineering, and that's where I'm at. So I was there with Bob Dratch, microwave scanning emissions technology. Bob's an old friend. He's been with us on many projects. And Bob had calculated this frequency here. We just happen to have the slide. Isn't that convenient? Here we are. So Bob had calculated this frequency right here. See that frequency? It's about 1.9 angstroms, which is the bond length associated with ADP-ATP, adenosine diphosphate, adenosine triphosphate. And if ever there was a physics of cellular radio, that's it. Because every time the cell has energy to put into the bank or take out of the bank, the cell metabolism, living cells, use the bond length of adenosine triphosphate diphosphate, which is a teeter-totter up and down. And that quantum distance between ADP and ATP is a frequency which radiates, indicating whenever somebody put a dollar bill into or out of the bank. I mean, took energy into or out of storage in the cell. It uses this ADP bond. So first note in my new calculations right here that that famous ADP bond length here, 1.9 angstroms, here's the equation for the cover of my book showing golden ratio times Planck length, and here we have 1.936 angstroms. So you see that ADP-ATP in the cell is part of implosive phase conjugate collapse, exactly like the two frequencies, the only two that motorize photosynthesis, which we've examined extensively elsewhere. So your spine liquid's imploding, your brainwaves are imploding, your ADP's imploding, your DNA's imploding, and they're all doing it tuned precisely golden ratio to Planck in order they're all imploding to the same center, which allows the pine cones to kiss noses. So back to Bob Dratch. So Bob calculated the microwave frequencies associated and built an extremely high gain microwave amplifier, which then he built a scanner, which he could scan, and he could scan the body for this critical series of frequencies. And he used, it was broad spectral, but one of the frequencies he started with was ATP. And well, Bob Dratch, you're asking about holoform. Bob Dratch was associated with Greg Hogue at Metaforms, and it was at Greg Hogue Metaforms' home outside Boulder where we did that work with Bob Dratch. You know, Greg Hogue makes these copper Sri yantras and other sacred geometries, Metaforms. And you asked about clairaudience, and yes, that's exactly what we're getting to here is clairaudience. That it was after this that later, when I lived basically, unfortunately, right in a sacred Cherokee burial ground in North Carolina, that I began to realize that I was hearing the voices of the ancient Cherokee shaman. I was hearing their ancestors. Quite literally, I heard their voices. And my clairaudience, you know, it's just like anything. If you train it, it gets good. And Valerie keeps telling me, like once in a while, I can actually talk to ancestors and have some pretty interesting conversations. But it happens only in certain places. Usually, for example, Prague, or in North Carolina, in certain places, in intense times. But that's another story. But we came to understand a lot more about the physics of clairaudience, this ringing you hear in your ear, triggered by this sangreal, this sound current, this song in the blood, which is behind many of the Grail legends. And now this sound current turns out to be exactly the low-frequency infrasound, which Benthoff measured in the spine liquid pump in training the brain's ventricle liquids. And remember, here we have the same cascade of frequencies of the infrasound being quite literally the Schumann resonance. Where's our Schumann resonance slide? Oh, we just happen to have that picture handy here. How convenient. Yes, this is a conversation we wanted to have. Right here, the picture's handy. It's good. So this is the same equation, the same cascade, Planck time, in this case exponent, exact integer exponent, golden ratio, and the mathematics points then to 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, 19.09 hertz, and compare that in blue on top to these green frequencies on the bottom, which are the exact known, documented frequency components of the sustained Schumann resonance harmonics of the planet, in spite of Greg Braden's confusion. The frequencies that actually comprise the Schumann harmonics are 3 here, almost 2.78, and 7.83, which is almost 7.29, and 14.3, not too far off from this 12, and 20.8 compared to this at 19.09. So within 1% or 2, you have the complete harmonic cascade of the Schumann harmonic series of the planet doing the same frequencies. And oh, by the way, let's plot that against the measured frequencies which correlate with human bliss process. So this is really where we wanted to go in tonight's conversation. This is the heart, one of the hearts of tonight's conversation, that we're looking here at a lady in Australia who was having an intense bliss experience. And it's interesting how we got there shamanically. She dealt with her childhood trauma, actually, and shortly after dealing with childhood trauma, suddenly she was released and had this incredible bliss experience. And we got 1, 2, 3, 4 brainwave harmonics in golden ratio. And not just, and this is the alpha in green here. This is, actually, you can actually see it here. This is the around 8.2 hertz here, but it's around 8 hertz. And this is the beta at around 13 hertz. And look at this correlation between the golden ratio harmonic series in the brain waves and the golden ratio harmonic series that is my equation and is the Schumann harmonics. Actually, the ratio of alpha to beta was originally defined as golden ratio, and now we know why, because the golden ratio harmonic cascade, called phase conjugation, which correlates to human bliss in brain waves, is a continuation of the necessary phase conjugate negentropic implosive collapse wave, which is brainwave harmonics, Schumann harmonics, the equation on the cover of my book, sacrocranial harmonics, hydrogen harmonics, DNA harmonics, photosynthesis harmonics. They all fit that equation. Why? Because that is the origin of biologic negentropy. That's the point. And that implosion is the very nature of bliss. That's the introduction to the conversation this evening. Now, that device which I invented here, called the Bliss Tuner, was selling for around $3,000, and we're looking for cheaper options right now. And we're evolving that biofeedback more in the iPhone arena, and we're putting out a much more advanced HRV version very soon, and you're going to hear more about that next week in the Heart Coherence course at Fractal University. But look soon, you will find new brainwave software coming from Implosion Group. Let's talk about some of the questions here. Yes, is Kundalini traumatic or pleasant, or is it a tiger to tame? You know, when Daniel Brinkley had his lightning experience, and Kundalini, we always say, is like inhabiting a lightning bolt. So Daniel Brinkley's near-death experience is a famous subject of his book on near-death, where afterwards, when he came back, everyone he would touch, his DNA had become a superconductor. We know why. And so everyone whom he would touch, he would suddenly have a flash of the key emotions of their life. He would see their emotional history just by touching them. And it was so disturbing that he could hardly stand it. So was that a tiger to tame? Yes. Actually, we know a lot about that physics, that if you take the dodecaratch helical slinky that is DNA, or if you do the same thing to a gold nanotube, and we know now that the gold's outer valence electrons are also the dodecaratchet, not unlike a carbon nanotube, which is measurably superconductive. That the point is that if you zap DNA with some amperage at the moment of crystallization, it measurably becomes a superconductor in the laboratory. We talked about the physics of superconductivity. And superconductivity has everything to do with Bliss experience. So here you have a tetracubic lattice. We've done this in the other courses here, just to do it again. But the path to superconductivity is when the tetracube jitterbugs, and this is the jitterbug that I learned personally from Bucky Fuller. So that stellated tetra, which is the cube octa, is jitterbugging to ecosa here, and it will jitterbug to octa here, which is the diamond light body story. But the ecosa here is the ecosa dodeca. 1 second. We get out all our toys, and we have religiously to use this toy for every lecture we do, the Star Mother kit. Because you see, let's see if we zoom in, the inner dodeca is self-similar and fractal to the outer dodeca. And that relationship is called fractal or self-embedded or self-similarity perfected. And so the ecosa dodeca infinite 3D stellation, which is the Star Mother kit, goldenmean.info/kit, which originally, incidentally, was the Greater Maze from Theosophy by Plummer, and he wrote the introduction to the Star Mother kit, and which we then subsequently proved with my new equation is a geometry of the radii of hydrogen. But further, now we know it's the geometry of Buckminster-Fullerene, carbon monoatomics, and the stability of the outer valence electron of the noble gases and the platinum group metals is the SPDF subshell completions, which the DF subshell completions we now know are dodecaecosa because 5-7 spin symmetry pair are the 10-14 electrons called the DNF subshell of the atomic table. So basically, when the DNF subshell are complete, noble gas or platinum group metals, you have then completed the Star Mother kit, making a path for infinite non-destructive collapse through center called superconductive. So this is implosive collapse defining superconductivity, and thus explains why when you zap DNA with a little bit of amperage at the moment of crystallization, like when they do with the gold monofilament, you get a superconductive effect, and that's actually in the literature. So we now know why Daniel Brinkley was having all these flashes, because his DNA had become a bit more superconductive and he was having trouble handling it. And we could talk about the movie Powder at some point. But the metaphor here is that the psychology is that to inhabit a lightning bolt, you can only think shareable thoughts. What does that mean? Now, we're still on your question. Is it possible to over-bliss, and is this pleasant, or is it a tiger to tame? Effectively, what happens in Kundalini is your breathing goes in a perfect damp sine wave to 0. It's called the Kundalini caduceus fire breath, based on golden ratio. And we do this in our conferences. So, and that's called perfect damping in wave mechanics, which is defined, which is basically a caduceus in wave mechanics called perfect damping. It's also idealized by golden ratio. And the implosion still point, when the breath goes to 0, there's a lot we could say about that. We know, for example, the actual sacrocranial practitioners who touch the fascia of people in the Therify implosive conjugate plasma, therify.net, Patrick reported specifically the spine liquid pump would go to a 0 point, which is commonly known as the healing turning point or the healing crisis, that when your spine liquid pump stops and then restarts again, it emerges from the still point with greater phase coherence, negentropy, healing, etc. So the nature of the still point is obviously the perfect metaphor for all of the things we're talking about: access to still point, access to 0 point. This is the central metaphor. But what does it mean in electrical engineering terms? That, let's talk about it in terms of the breath. Let's see, we have a golden mean ratio fire breath training animation and series and originally some software at goldenmean.info/caduceus. And so I will put the link in here. So we actually had software to teach the caduceus fire breath, but at least you'll see the graphics here. One moment. No, I'm putting the link in there. So there you see some of the original software we wrote. You can actually make a variable caduceus breathing trainer, which, by the way, all of which is very elegantly in the new version of heartsring.com, which is going to be called I Thrive. And that is coming soon. In fact, we will have a preliminary announcement for you for the advanced version of the HRV I Thrive software for iOS. And the programmer hopefully will join us next time in the advanced heart biofeedback course here on Fractal U. So that is coming soon. But we were back on the conversation about what it means when you get to that still point and why you feel this fire up your spine. Well, let's talk about it in terms of what's happening in the breath, and then let's talk about what's happening in the spine liquid pump. First of all, in the terms of the breath, if you did a caduceus fire breath properly, when you reach that still point, theoretically, you can very comfortably stop breathing for a while. Now, if you speak to any of the yogis who just emerged from a sealed underground coffin for 2 weeks, having not had zero air and come out perfectly happy, and there are many yogis who can do this, they can explain to you that this is in fact related to perfect relaxation, which is perfect conductivity. Perfect conductivity is related to phase conjugation and fractality. But what does it mean practically in the brain? How is the brain surviving for this yogi who's in this coffin sealed underground for 2 weeks with zero air and emerges just fine? What's the physics? Well, I know personally that doing Kundalini, I could stop breathing for very extended lengths of time. And I knew that, and I felt that when that was happening, this lightning up my tailbone would like become incendiary, incandescent, top of the head feeling like a, as they say in Kundalini, top of your head feels like a red hot coal that you can't get out. So what is it about stopping breathing that gets you to this lightning? This is related to understanding the physics of respiration. That the reason you breathe is so that oxygen can pump the conjugation of phases you call respiration. However, if you got your body to implosive, perfect phase conjugate electrical environment, inside and outside, absolutely no reason to breathe. I can tell you for sure. So basically, a totally blissful internal environment and a totally fractal and phase conjugate outside environment. And we defined exactly what that outside electrical environment is, the electrical definition of sacred space, and 3 ways it is measured electrically. And those 3 ways are depicted on the top graphic at goldenmean.info/architecture. So we're very specific about what we mean by, sacred space, fractal air outside your body, and fractality, implosion, charge density inside your body. Bottom line is, when you get to that phase conjugate space, it's obvious why you don't need to breathe, because the phase conjugate pump wave you were getting from oxidation is coming from a much longer wave context. Basically, perception is a phase conjugate field effect, which generally is pumped by oxidation. But if you have another source for the phase conjugate pump wave, of course you don't need oxygen. It's actually obvious. Because if you know what perception is, then you know how you can build that pump wave, and you know what can replace oxygen is making the pump. I could carry on this, but you get the flavor of what I'm saying is all these things that were considered a spiritual mystery, and they are beautiful, but they are beautiful physics. And once you understand the physics, you can do it. And you don't require miracle worship and personality worship. This is my little mantra. Okay. So now let's talk about the spine liquid pump aspect of this and the psychological implications. Again, we're talking about Kundalini and peak bliss experience. Bob Dratch measured extreme radiance of the cellular microwave during bliss, and we know that those frequencies of microwave were explicitly the waveguides of the carvings on the pyramid walls, which is why the insects navigate in the radiance from the carvings of ancient stone dolmen, because they're making coherent microwave, which is the bloodstream of insect antennae physics. This is Phil Callahan 101. So microwave coherence and microwave amplifiers is the best introduction to the physics of magic, for example. And microwave coherence is a big part of Kundalini. Let me give you another example. After the classic Australian Aboriginal shaman just finished walking 1,000 miles to get the right ochre paint. Ochre has an iron content, and this is from Benthoff. And he would then paint that ochre iron paint on his face. And how far the Kundalini microwave had traversed on the face was directly indicated by how far the spiral coherence was painted in the ochre. So the ochre paint on the face of the shaman, the iron paint, iron waveguide, conductive, the whole story, was an indicator of how far the Kundalini coherent microwave had proceeded in his body, and a direct indicator of how big were the tornadoes that shaman could steer. I mean, literally, this high-frequency, high-quality microwave is the physics of insect navigation. We know that for sure. It's the physics of DNA radio, et cetera, et cetera. We know it's pure phase conjugate implosive collapse. And it's how shaman project their aura, their plasma. Remember, we defined last week, shamanism as being plasma projective. And we're about here now to define bliss as being plasma implosive, which is the prerequisite to plasma charge radiance. So we're agreeing with all of this religious literature showing the auras of saints, but we're saying charge radiance is always preceded by charge implosion. And that fractal attractor for charge, implosive chi, orgone, spirit, baraka, shaktipat, is the physics of bliss. So that was a little bit about the shamanic aspect of the high frequency component. And there was a UV and a microwave, and we can have fun with that. And the ultraviolet component we speak about in the physics of cancer conversation at therify.net. Basically, short summary. If we take our caduceus again, and we just happen to have one handy, imagine this is cell metabolism. The long waves coming into cell metabolism are food, longer protein chains. And then you have mitochondrial subcomponents, subcellular organelles, and then you have DNA precursors, and then you have high-quality ultraviolet light, blue fire, which every biophysicist will tell you is the motor and regulator of cell metabolism. So essentially, the cell is in the business of making high-quality ultraviolet light, blue fire, sex juice, the creative stuff. And when that high-quality ultraviolet light builds up at cell center, there's nothing to do with it except meiosis, mitosis, cell division. So cancer happens if the blue fire, high-quality UV, is stuck at center. If, however, you create permission to touch, remember, contact inhibition is functionally the only definition of cancer. If touch does not inhibit replication, that defines cancer. Well, that touch is a charge propagation pathway for the high frequencies, which is why if the cell gets hard and spherical, then touch does not inhibit replication because the ultraviolet has no way out, and thus that spherical cells define cancer as well. So spheres are pretty bad for biologic architecture as well for the same reason. So a phase conjugate power supply like Therify.net or a Bliss process, or Kundalini, which provides this implosive path out through center for that ultraviolet, allowing DNA memory, DNA radio, cellular memory, implosion of charge, implosion of spirit, implosion of memory, implosion of biologic information, to go through the 0 point at the Planck dimension and be radiated superluminal longitudinally and enter DNA radio. That's called joining the collective unconscious, joining the communion of saints, being able to talk to ancestors. And we talk a lot about that physics. And so that's why that ringing you start hearing in your ears during peak, bliss kind of Kundalini experiences actually can be ancestral memory. Remember, Korotkov had measured how ancestral memory is accessed, that you actually need fractal air, so that this ability to access ancestral memory is related to being able to embed in that phase conjugate longitudinal field tuned by this precise frequency signature called the origin of biologic negentropy, as it were on the cover of my book. And it's worth mentioning at this point that when Professor Korotkov tracked, and we talked about this before, when Korotkov tracked the Cozy Rev mirror people around the planet, so 2,000 miles apart, you have this metal cylinder carefully placed at a ley line, magnetic line cross, measured in nanoteslas, and this metal cylinder, which we now know, microwave coherent, microwave tuned radiator. So sitting inside this microwave tuned metal cylinder at the ley line crosses, they had dependable, more dependable than radio technology. They had dependable telepathy every time. The telepathy worked every time. And Korotkov spent years documenting this. So now we know the physics. The cellular microwave ATP in this microwave tuned cavity at a phase conjugate grid, dodecaecos or Earth grid node, imploding the phase conjugate collapse wave, all of which means communion with cellular radio and the collective unconscious. Hence, DNA radio, dependable telepathy, and Korotkov measuring where Kogi can make phone calls to the ancestors. It's all the same phase conjugate, implosive, longitudinal wave mechanic kind of physics. Hence, when you have this Kundalini experience and you got this lightning going up your tailbone, suddenly Bentov called this the great masts of God in his book Stalking the Wild Pendulum, which was the Icelandic term for the Kundalini. And what they meant by a great mast of God was that you have these massive biologic radio transducers, and if you have clairvoyance or clairaudience, that people having intense Kundalini can be seen from a distance, like a great mast of a ship. And it should be said that Kundalini and Bliss process are contagious, and they have critical mass. It's true that when I used to have Kundalini so intensely, if I went into the office, more of the ladies would have headaches around me. Why? Because the spine liquid pump, if you're stuck in your head and you don't get grounded enough, the grounding is essential to remain sane, as is the fluids. And we talked about the fact, the therapeutic value of the earthing phenomena, that by getting access to the ground, you avoid some of the insanity aspects of too much bliss, because you remain in phase, in fractal phase conjugate electrical relationship with the earth. So remember when we talked about how Professor Callahan measured whether the Schumann harmonics were present in a tree was predictor of how long that tree was going to live. And those measurements we have here. He used there's the link, goldenmean.info/trees. So he used hemp fibers and dipped them in sea salt and a brainwave preamplifier, a spectrum analyzer. We did that work for years. And you could tell whether a tree was going to live or die based on whether the Schumann harmonic series was present or absent. That's called harmonic inclusiveness, predicts vitality. And harmonic inclusiveness is optimized by phase conjugation. Well, what about predicting whether a building is going to create life or death. This is biologic architecture 101. So of course, if you're above the third story of any building, the health statistics say that you're going to have more health problems. Well, why? Because your access to the low frequency harmonic cascade called phase conjugate implosion, called grounding, determines your ability to stay in phase relationship with your environment, which means, can you distribute your charge or do you isolate your charge? If you isolate your charge, you're going to have troubles, ungroundedness, et cetera, stuck in your head. Whereas if you're barefoot in the mud and barefoot on real rock and you're living in a house made of biological materials where the capacitor can breathe implosively, then you have access to this sustained bliss. And Wayne says, trekking in the high altitude mountain ranges would give me energy, coming back down with more energy than when I went up. Blue skies, sun clean. Exactly. That's what we're talking about. Access to a charge dense environment. So we constantly remind people that of the yogis who lived to be hundreds of years old, many documented in India, 0 of them did it in a metal house. 100% of them did it in a cave in the woods. What does this tell you? If you would like some immortality, you're going to need a different kind of capacitance than a steel and aluminum house full of electrosmog and dead air. It ain't going to allow any kind of immortality, because charge implosion is immortality. Yes, Kevin says, thank you for the information on ear ringing. Yeah, Valerie knows which part of which ear is going to ring when her deceased mother is calling. Clairaudience is an interesting thing. I had it with Cherokee shaman, and I had it with some shaman in South America. Then I had it in Prague for a little while, and you know, clairvoyance and clairaudience is like any other skill. It evolves if you discipline it. And we do mention here that clairvoyance is enabled by Therify.net, because the plasma compression of the high voltage lights up the aura. So seeing auras is a lot easier when you have plasma on fire around you, living plasma, which is what Therify.net is. So it's fun to. Years ago, when we went to Aura Vision Class 101 with Christopher Hills in the hills outside of Santa Cruz, if we'd had the Therify, it'd have been an entirely different course. You know, he said, well, you need to defocus your eyes and look through and look behind, totally relax, and now put that person against a black or white backdrop and see that little glow and be very, very still, and the charge radiance, you begin to see the aura. This is Aura Vision 101. It's very useful. But if you do this in the context of accelerating the charge of the person there, you obviously make Aura Vision a lot easier. Thomas Geckler says, watch for my aura. Therify is due here this week. Yes, hopefully tomorrow, Thomas, with any luck. We look forward to that. So people, you have access to try the Therify in Georgia. Contact Thomas Geckler. That's all cooking nicely, hopefully. We'll be in touch there and make the experience available. And we're collecting the clinical data. So far, it's really true that almost everybody there's all kinds of stories which are at this point anecdotal. Been very helpful in healing cysts, and Prairie was very helpful in healing tumors. But I can say from my own experience, having with dozens and dozens of people who have tried that plasma system, Therify.net, that almost, if not everyone who came with pain left with much less pain. It was quite dramatic, actually. And we think we understand the physics quite well, that pain is charge compression that's bleeding because the fractality is broken. We talked about this before. So restored compression is electrically the opposite of pain, just like it's the opposite of cancer. So again, restored compression is the solution to fill in the blanks. Every mystery, disease among them. Restored compression is restored negentropy, which obviously is the opposite of disease. So it makes sense that restoring charge compression reduces pain, because the system becomes organic. Basically, pain, as we said, was invented by God to invite you to put your attention there, and attention restores the compression. Okay. One other part of the conversation about bliss, which was Kevin's asking about advances in skin sciences. Well, Thomas Geckler's partner with the Therify is a doctor named Bart Flick in the Atlanta area, who's famous for wound healing. He's famous for silver colloidal healing, and he's famous for a Rife frequency device. And we believe that wound healing and skin healing, etc., is related dramatically to this restored centripetal force, because what a wound in the skin is basically the capacitance is bleeding charge. So it's just like, you know, doctors know you put compression on a wound, but if the compression is elegant symmetry electrically, all the more useful and powerful, hence the Therify. And also, we could talk, and we'll talk elsewhere, but the Therify, we believe, and Bart Flick is helping us pioneer this work, that the dedifferentiation switch to stem cell production is essentially fractal fields. And that's why Bart Flick was so enthused and confident to try the phase conjugate fields on stem cell switch, because obviously dedifferentiation is fractal compression success. Hence, a perfectly fractal field is related. And thank you, Thomas, for putting Bart's information there, Clayton, Georgia. Also, Clayton, Georgia is where Marty Woodkey comes from, who is the guy who taught me how to measure the brain waves of bliss. So it all fits together. A couple more things we wanted to say about the brain waves of bliss here. I wanted to show the history of the measurement of bliss, and I wanted to discuss the political aspect, actually. So first, let's do the history. History of the measurement of bliss. This is Professor Korotkov in Russia, and here he has been assigned at the World Without Blindness Project in St. Petersburg to measure those who were successful in seeing without their eyes. So in the psychological training to see without your eyes, which is essentially a bliss discipline, it's coming to enough stillness inside to look at the white screen inside and use that to see, literally. It's like seeing with your pineal gland, the inner eye. I found out, for example, that when they put the electrodes on the top of my heads after I had Kundalini, I could see the color of those electrodes dependably through the top of my head with my eyes closed. So I realized I was seeing through the top of my head. As the children in Mexico famously are seen blindfolded, and they can detect colors through their finger. A very similar phenomenon. So teaching people to see without their eyes, whether they're blind or not, is a famous project in Russia. Abranikov and our friend Paul and Kelly in Canada, they're working with Abranikov and this technique of seeing without their eyes. So, and which is obviously related to peak perception. So Korotkov here on this particular slide had the job of measuring success. So if you measure those who can see without their eyes electrically, what do you find? And that's this chart here, the bioelectrographic correlates of altered or peak states of consciousness. And number one, the primary finding he found was the extensive and steady fractal fluctuations in the spectrum of the EEG with the attractors. In other words, the most common condition being that the ratio between the harmonics of the brain waves was 1.618, golden ratio. So golden ratio in brain waves was the primary way Korotkov knew someone was now going to be able to see without their eyes. And Korotkov did this just before I invented the device to measure this, the Bliss tuner. This is why all of this is the centerpiece of the literature on phase conjugate wave mechanics as a cause of perception, which is the central article for this course tonight, fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. And the other things that Korotkov measured here, disappearance of bilateral frontal asymmetry, essentially the right and left hemispheres were in phase. And then the other thing, as in C to summarize, was the size of the aura increased. Very simple. Your brain waves implode and your aura gets bigger. Oh, cool. Could that be more simple or what? So in terms of the history of the measurement of Bliss process, I usually mention one other thing here. Bring this over and zooming in further. I love playing with the zoom here. Okay, this is the picture in black here from a device that we used in Boulder years ago called the mind mirror. And the mind mirror showed your alpha and your beta brainwave harmonics, right and left hemisphere, as a frequency cascade. And then they had these pictures for all these different states of consciousness, which were advanced states of consciousness. And their picture of the way your brainwaves would look when you're having a creative, spiritual, or bliss state, this was their picture in the mind mirror literature. Now, if you actually do the mathematics, which they did not apparently, and take the ratio between this frequency of alpha in their own picture and this frequency of beta, you get golden ratio. So in effect, the mind mirror people discovered that golden mean ratio was the creative and bliss spiritual state, except they never noticed that it was golden mean ratio, but their picture itself is proof, which is to say that golden mean ratio in brainwaves has been around a long time, but the pure principle of how it works is new, and I'm the one who pioneered that understanding, which is right here, that a caduceus implosion or phase conjugation is what's causing peak perception in brainwaves. Now, the next thing that we were supposed to talk about in this evening's course was the political implications, or the macro, let's call it the macro psychological implications. Remember when we defined being a shaman as being able to project your plasma, your charge, your aura, your ka, your boat to the underworld. We defined the Kaaba of the Merkaba of Egypt. The Ka is the amount of coherence in your aura, and the Ba is that part of it which can go superluminal and longitudinal, the Kaaba. And so ability to be plasma projected also defines what in Egypt or in Jerusalem was called Stargate. And this is just an introduction to what Anton Parks very usefully discusses in great detail under the term Dharana, which basically is the ancients' word for Stargate. But Stargate means more than, where you take your spacecraft to get accelerated rapidly. It means more where you take your plasma to get accelerated rapidly, which is exactly what you need to do to survive death successfully, and also exactly what you need to do to get your aura in a squirt gun through the heart of our star. Otherwise, unfortunately, you're stuck in kindergarten. Not so happy. So we're trying to evolve a description of the graduation of the human experience into becoming what the ancestors called sun god. We all knew that, your God and my God, whose God's bigger? Well, we know that if your God arrives in a heavy metal craft, they're probably from the wrong side of the tracks. Where if they arrive in a plasma ball that just came through the heart of the star, then probably they're worth a conversation. This is what they mean by sun god, which is a plasma being that has enough phase coherence to go through the heart of a star. And this is called growing up. And this is what was meant by sun god. And we started this Solar Heart community, the Solar Shamans group at yahoogroups.com, of all these shamans who were doing this, projecting their aura through the heart of the sun. Remember, the heart of the sun, the Anu, is the same slip knot as the heart of the human and the heart of hydrogen, and we talked about that at length. So this ability to have access to a plasma projector is actually what building a temple, Uru Asa LM, Uru means ancient dragon blood, Asa means the queen or royal lineage of, L means the place of translation of vorticity, the place of the phase shift. This is an L. This is where rotational inertia is translated into linear inertia. And to make this L or phase shift, to translate vorticity in your blood, in your DNA, in your aura, is to be able to produce the longitudinal component and thus you become Elohim. Elohim, they were the wannabes, you know. If you could get all of your biological memory into a longitudinal wave, and then you get remote plasma containment, you know, you were graduated. And that was a genetic disaster, the Nephilim, when they. And this is a story we're going to tell in the ET Origins of DNA course coming up at fractalu.com. The point for here being the political role of Bliss in this process from graduating off the surface of planets. A couple points to be made here. One is that a beehive will not swarm unless its plasma has grown to the point where it is projectable. If you could see the aura of a beehive, they swarm only when they have what's called a body polis, a plasma coherent envelope that is thus navigable. And then royal, you know, queen is required because implosive DNA, something called royal DNA, which actually just means embeddable DNA, which is to say star navigable DNA, is required to navigate that tornado, that plasma storm of the beehive swarming. Well, this applies to people. People are designed to have a collective bliss experience that makes their collective plasma bubble navigable, taking the silver seed to a new home in the sun, as it were. So, classically, your investment in getting a gene pool to grow up, this is like, we call this Enki's lament. You know, he went to all this work to hack up this gene pool, this DNA that can be the vaccine for the trauma of his ancestors. Enki's ancestors are doing Groundhog Day, and that's us. We are the vaccine for the Orion Wars. and so in order to get his gene pool to the critical launch threshold, so they're not stuck in kindergarten on small planets a long way from downtown called Earth, whose sun is about to burp. I mean, the real estate here has limited value because the sun burps so often, so you really need to learn how to graduate, because being stuck in kindergarten just ain't fun. So the idea was they gave Akhenaten this job, and we're going to talk about this more in that other course, but Akhenaten had a job to build a solar temple, Amenti Amarna, which is where, and the Syrians gave him the job. And you line up these great plasma accelerators, charged dense environments, like the pyramids at Bosnia, for example. And Amenti Amarna was supposed to be a stargate, a Dharana. And you know, Anton Parks is right. Generally, the war happens because they're fighting over access to the Stargate, because everyone wants to have access to liftoff because they don't want to get stuck. You do not want to be the left behind. A religious fundamentalist can tell you that. You do not want to be the left behind. It's a famous book series. It's kind of a joke. But in fact, you know, the reason there's a war over Jerusalem is because the Stargate's there. It's old news. The new information is that particular Stargate's broken, and you got to know how to build one, or you're effectively toast. The Stargate is a plasma projector, a plasma imploder. An array of tubes like the Theraphi is, in fact, the Dharana. And the shaman in the Theraphi, they experience it. So, oh yeah, there's a wormhole. I can see down the tube. You know, I can project my plasma. I can move my aura elsewhere. I can do the Jodie Foster trick in the movie Contact down the dodecahedron. So the intent was that a group of people have done the hard work to learn how to lucid dream together. Have you done that work yet? It's a fun. You get your soul group. You learn how to do your yoga together. You learn how to cry together. You learn to have bliss together, and then you learn how to lucid dream together. A very good indicator of successful death. It just means your aura is electrically phase coherent enough to be propagable, otherwise known as your Ka, your boat into the underworld. So you get that group together, and then you get into this plasma accelerator, Dharana, right time and space aligned with astrological alignments, the Sothis rising helical star series, and the whole soul group can then be projected into the star coherently. This is the Egyptian technology of the immortality of the king. It is plasma projection. It's why the tubes in the pyramids pointed, etc., etc., etc. So Not only do you need access to Bliss process, but you need access to the discipline and soul group to make use of this in a coherent way. The climax part of this is the political the political implications of Bliss. Our little joke we always tell is that once you understand this, that functionally, electrically, if you have access to Bliss, you have access to DNA radio. So it's the next step past, first you had a library, and then you had the internet, and then you had Bliss. The Bliss is the ultimate internet. It truly is. So it's the ultimate information communion. It means functionally when you have access to Kundalini, you can focus on any problem, and all biologic radio is right there answering your questions, quite literally answering your questions. This is why when you're in the Therify, it's so important to talk to your inner, talk to your cells, talk to your inner tornado, steer the tornado. The Therify plasma is going to launch, is going to accelerate your tornado, but if there's no one there steering, so essentially it means set your intent. Because remember, the tornado follows the center of lowest pressure called conjugate implosion, which is your intention. Tiller measured focused human attention causes compression. So functionally then, when you have Bliss, you have access to the climax form of the internet. 2, when you have Bliss, you are like a pine cone. You have access to voltage from gravity, which means that you have your own source of charge. Which means at that point, you probably don't need a government. I'm sorry, this is bad news for governments around the planet, but when you have your own source, which is why any group that gets access to a Bliss process is the first thing every government tries to kill, because obviously if that group has a collective Bliss experience, they're suddenly going to fuse into what's called a political body polis. Now, I'm not saying this in a revolutionary sense. I'm just saying that the ultimate way in which bodies of polis, political bodies, should be formed is core groups that have access to a Bliss process together, because this is plasma fusion. It's natural, it's beautiful, and it's totally self-empowerment, and it's the only real meaning of the possibility of forming a government. And in fact, I believe we can now prove that Bliss is the only way to get an immune system sustained, harmonic inclusiveness, big vitality, and Bliss is the only way to get enough aura to make you independent and enough aura to enable successful birth and death. Therefore, as an electrical engineer and biologist, I state the obvious that Bliss is the highest and only functional purpose for having a government. This might be new information for George Bush. There, I've said my joke. No, but what we could say was that if you understood the electrical biology of the possibility of having Bliss, then you could decide how to design a school, a hospital, a government. You could answer Kurt Vonnegut's question in Breakfast of Champions, whiskey over the bar at breakfast time. You could answer his question, which was, what are people for? Oh, our plasma body can grow up and we can inhabit stars. We measured the solar flares decreased dramatically 11 times when 1 million people meditated at the same time. Electrical engineering, what happened? They added centripetal force. They added negentropy. They answered the question, what are people for? Suddenly, the sun responded to collective human emotion. Why do stars go to so much trouble to cook up DNA? Obviously, we now know the answer, because we add a centripetal force which makes star birth sustainable. So this is a radical reinvention of the concept of politics, in my view. Politics is the possibility of a group of people. It's kind of like collective tantra, actually. It's fusion of plasma, e pluribus unum, from many one. This is my body. What did he mean? The principal Christos. He meant, how do you fuse your plasmas to think and move as one? When human bodies are assembled of X number of billion cells, each one has the privilege of being more different once they achieve agreement. So the same is true with groups of people. If they can agree And the perfect form of agreement of waves is implosive, phase conjugate, and fractal. So the end of this part of the course was to be my old joke about when I did the lecture in the Italian church, and I've told this joke too many times. And I said, well, the definition of culture is not the color of your shoe polish and the color of your wine and the color of your necktie. No, this is not the definition of culture. The definition of culture is if you have the skill to teach your children how to have a bliss experience. We just defined bliss as the only way to get an immune system and the only way to get immortal. So that's a pretty good definition of culture. And from that definition of culture, we in the West do not have culture. So I'm sorry to inform the cultural ministers of most of Europe and the West that unfortunately you do not have culture. Sorry. No. You know who had culture? Aboriginals, indigenous peoples. They had the skill to teach their young people how to have a bliss experience. Now here's your young people. They're out there, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, willing absolutely to risk death to get bliss. Have you ever, how many people risk death at rave concerts to have bliss process? Of course. Now, the correct response of the adults when your teenager exhibits total willingness to risk death to get bliss, you know what you should say to your teenager? You say, congratulations, without bliss, you are toast. So yes, you risk death if you do not get bliss. However, sex, drugs, and rock and roll may have certain health issues, like here's the GDV, and I will measure your recreational drugs, and here's the holes in your aura. So maybe that's not the best way. No. So once you have the scientific skill to instruct your young people, the biologic imperative for what bliss is and how to get there, then you have culture. And that's what that's the subtitle of this course, is that bliss is a biologic imperative. Because in effect, when you don't have bliss, you're relying on others for energy, which means functionally, from an electrical engineering perspective, until you have your own source of bliss, you are functionally, electrically a parasite. Also, your first access to the true internet, biological DNA radio, is bliss. And ultimately, your only way to get immortal is bliss. Therefore, bliss is kind of important. So here's your teenager coming up to mom and saying, hey, Ma, I think I really need to have a bliss experience. Mother, do you have an answer? You know, other than sex, drugs, and rock and roll, not all of which is bad. So the answer to that question, we wrote a book, actually, to try to answer that question. And that book is called Implosion, Secret Science of Ecstasy and Immortality. And the complete color PDF of that book is at the link, goldenmean.info/consciouskids. And we go through an introduction to the hygiene, which in, I think it's about 1 or 2 weeks from tonight, we have the practical introduction to the hygiene for bliss process. So we're going to go into that in depth, but just briefly, obviously, the live food, charge dense environment, and the yoga. Why the yoga? When you have lightning going through your body, if you don't develop the inner muscle to steer that lightning, you kind of go nuts. Sexual perversion, all kinds of problems. No, you definitely require the yoga. There's the sacred gymnastic. There's the test, Carlos Castaneda, tensegrity. We taught all these things. But some form of the discipline of movement. Remember, the Tai Chi is about moving your finger if you moved your finger in the right spiral, the right change of velocity, at the end of that movement, you would feel a little bit of a tingle in the tip of your finger. And the rate of change of the rate of change, that calculus of curvature called the quality of grace, the physics of chi, is the implosion of capacitance. So in the process of learning this gracefulness of the Tai Chi, of the sacred gymnastic, your body learns to implode charge, and that is why the discipline of yoga is so critical. The other thing that's so interesting about bliss process as hygiene discipline is one of the things that Jasmine was teaching in when she did these courses on how to live without food. I think it also applies in how to live with bliss. That yes, you needed to learn how to walk barefoot in nature with a certain time of the day in order you had to spend enough time in nature to implode the capacitance. That's real. And then basically learn how to learn to live off chi, live off prana, which is a well-known concept. And we've known people with Jasmine who are thriving very well without food. It's real. And you have to. It's a discipline, and a lot of it is, of course, breathing. Right way to charge. But the fun part of the Jasmine's message that I particularly enjoyed was when she said, the other thing you need to be doing in order to live off chi is that you need to spend a certain amount of your time every day doing whatever it is you believe is your highest level of service. Think about that. If you think about the nature of death, we said death was invented by biology to gently teach us to stop trying to store unshareable thoughts. So in the center of a lightning bolt, the reason an unshareable thought generates heat is because it's not compressible. It's not implodable. It's not scalable. It doesn't do scale invariance very well. Whereas if you are thinking about pure principle, perfectly sure, thoughts which are of service to all of DNA, ultimately charged symmetry that serves collective evolution, then that can withstand the spin density at the lightning core of DNA. You're thinking about pure principle. You've had a eureka moment. So if you're focused on absolute pure principle, then you can stay in the center of lightning bolt indefinitely and you won't get toasted. However, if you start thinking about anger and how much somebody hurt me and what this, blah, 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 in a million years, that's not going to mean anything, and it definitely isn't going to make it through death. So preparing for bliss is just like preparing for death. You need to get your thoughts together and sort your memories into the shareable. That's why they say at the end of each day, relive the events of the day and play it like a movie until you can play the film without interruption, and then you'll know you've processed the emotion. It's all prepared for compression. So this is the bit about entering into charge density, entering into temple, entering into the therapy. If you can relax perfectly, the center point is there and the bliss point is there. And this is Hygiene for Bliss 101. Did I miss some questions here? Lisa says, I'm wondering about the bliss for my dear friend, appendix love sensor. Oh. Appendix. I wonder if in her intestines with the appendix had something to do with embedding in longer waves. Oh. Well, Lisa, our friend Peter, who runs that wonderful healing center in Belgium, who's testing and developing the Therify.net there and the Imploder Spa, which is now Fountain of Life today, amazing healing center, and doing that nano hydrogen, all these implosion therapies in one place, Purify goes fine. It's all in Belgium there. So your friend in England might be able to afford to take a trip to Belgium. Could be a very useful experience. Certainly regenerative, the Therify after surgery, it could be very relevant. So first step probably would be to introduce your friend to Peter and remind me, I'll send you a contact to Peter in Belgium, and she could have a chat and just see if she felt inspired to visit the center in Belgium. Robert says, does being stuck in kindergarten imply reincarnation with loss of memory? Yes, actually, Robert, I do think being stuck in kindergarten implies reincarnation with loss of memory. Essentially, the reason you need to forget stuff when you die is because you tried to remember things that weren't shareable. So if you approach death with every memory being pure principle, pure shareable, then in the next life, all those memories would still be useful. So essentially, all you're doing with forgetting at death is setting aside useless memories. But useful memories can come through the compression. So absolutely, once you learn to focus on shareable thoughts, you bring your memories through death. Solar storms hitting us. Yes, yes. Okay. So now there was an outline for this course. I see it's 15 minutes to the end of the presentation portion. And I want to go back to this outline, which is page 1 and 2 here. This PDF is available that I'm using. The PDF is available for you for this course at learnitlive.com/fractalu. This PDF is also on top of the link, which is the centerpiece of this course, which is fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. So I'm just going to now review this course outline and just see if we kind of like did our shtick. Okay, so we did this history of the measurement of peak perception of bliss. Yes, and we talked about Korotkov and that golden ratio, the role of golden ratio phase conjugation, EEG. We did that. Yes, and we talked about aura plasma becoming centripetal embedded and gathered, charge gathering. Golden ratio is a wave mechanic of harmonic inclusiveness. You remember the article about harmonic inclusiveness, that you could predict the viability of every living thing by when the harmonics were maximally inclusive. The article on that is goldenbean.info/hierarchy. There's the link. And that started with the heart rate variability literature, but applies to every biologic oscillator. And clearly, maximum harmonic inclusiveness is phase conjugate golden ratio. So to get enough frequencies in one oscillator to create immortality, only golden ratio allows that. That's why the Lakowski people said, oh, it was just maximum number of frequencies, but they didn't do the math to realize that the maximum number of frequencies to survive together in one place is golden ratio. Yes, and the immune function is aura coherence, how all are connected together. This creates prerequisites for lucid dreaming, successful death. There's the article, the applications article, yes, yes. Here, this is something we didn't talk about enough. The nature of bliss process and the communion of saints is a phase conjugate dielectric or fractal field. Just to mention that in this famous paper, Alice in Barium Titanate Land, and there's the link, they show that phase conjugate dielectrics, like barium titanate, they create these charge fields that appear to find each other at a distance as if self-aware. That's why they call it Alice in Barium Titanate Land. It's a very good introduction to how we think the collective unconscious actually works. That if we're right that phase conjugate dielectrics create these self-aware little plasma fields which talk to each other at a distance, remote action at a distance, connection at a distance, which we know longitudinals will do, that then this tells us something about why you could hear the voice of God. I mean the collective unconscious. I mean ancestor voices. You can hear them very well in a stone circle in a sacred forest, but go into an aluminum building with lots of electrosmog and dead air, like modern hospitals, and no, the voice of God isn't so loud there. It's physics that you need to understand the physics of consciousness in order to understand the physics of spirituality in order to do it. So you're not dumb enough to spend half your life in a metal building full of dead air and electrosmog, because your aura and your spiritual body and your communion of saints and your voices of ancestors ain't going to work so good. Also understanding why it's so essential to design places for birth and death based on the science of sacred space. It's critical because this embedding is how you take the memory through. Dante is asking, is the new book in print and how do I get one? The new book, Origin of Biologic Negentropy, the introduction is at fractalfield.com/fractalspacetime, and that's where you can order the book. The new version of that book, which is version 2, which has 23 additional pages with all the new physics that we've discovered since the first version, including ATP and Meyer wave, all the new physics there and mention of Mark's work. That new version with the 23 pages is now the PDF version that's for sale there, and everyone that's registered for that, for this course, gets that PDF for free, but I'm not going to mention that link here because this film becomes public. But if you want the link, it will be in your welcome package. And that 23-page expanded version is now the distributed PDF at the private link, and is now the Amazon version, and the print version will be here in approximately 10 days. So 10 days from now, we'll begin shipping the new version of the book, just to answer your question. Thank you. If Wayne says, if we had complete worldwide bliss, we need not have a military to fight peace. Exactly. Actually, we're saying more than that. We're saying a new definition of peacemaking derives directly from understanding the living physics of the fractal field. And that is what is the curriculum at goldenmean.info/Peace University. So specifically, we say peacemaking in wave mechanics is very, very specifically defined. That if you understand the origin of negentropy, phase conjugate fractal fields imploding, that defines peacemaking because it defines self-organization and it defines sustainability. So suddenly sustainable architecture, sustainable, a microclimate, all these things about sustainability, Gaia's wave mechanics become defined as a wave mechanics which has equations of how waves make peace. Now, once we understood how waves make peace, we can make a magnetic map of a city that makes peace. Remember when Phil Callahan discovered that war breaks out where the magnetic map breaks down? We know how to make a magnetic map that creates peacemaking because it literally hooks up the emotion of Village A with Village B, with Turkey, with Russia. Suddenly the magnetic lines align and the emotions of the people make the DNA radio work, and suddenly there's contact permission, and that's called peacemaking. And he proved it. Where the underground water disappeared in Vukovar in Yugoslavia, he went to Israel, Ireland, Israel, and Yugoslavia to the war zones and proved that where the magnetic lines break down, you can predict in advance war is going to break out, or the magnetic lines are not fractal or conductive. This was called paramagnetism and Phil Callahan. It's all there at Peace University. So we can define peacemaking in brainwave science, define peacemaking in building science. We can define peacemaking in the magnetic layout of cities, define peacemaking in breath science, define peacemaking in everything, once we understand the physics of negentropy. So yes, this is a peace curriculum, and there it is. Actually, the people with the Nobel Group in Norway helped us develop that Peace University curriculum. goldenmean.info/Peace University. And it's a dream come true from years ago when we worked on that curriculum, that now we have more of the physics to prove it, including the Therify, which is implosive peacemaking for plasma. Okay, moving right along in our little outline for this class, what have we not finished? So we did Allison Barium Titanate Land. The electrical nature of the collective unconscious requires you do the discipline of living charge fields. If you want communion with the collective unconscious, then you need a certain electrical environment to make that possible. Yes, the nature of the divine is perfectly branched as the physics of the makeable fractal field. Thus, this is how bliss is limited by the environment. That's just what we're talking about. Hence, fractality in African architecture. We talked about that. That you remember that picture of the village where all of the natural fiber little huts in the village are arranged in a pine cone-like fractal, and the actual layout of fractal architecture in Africa came from Enki, we think. And the next thing in the outline was the yoga for bliss, about the inner smile. Oh yeah, we didn't talk about the inner smile, did we? The following thing, we talked about the role of bliss in a purpose of humanity and the purpose of bliss in the origin of politics. So we did talk about that. But what about in the yoga of the inner smile? Well, we're going to probably talk about this more when we go into the hygiene in the next course. But just since that's the one thing that was in the curriculum outline we didn't do, what does it take in order to like yourself? What does it take in order to love yourself? Why is it that if you do not love yourself, you cannot allow another person to love you? Why is it that you choose to die when you believe you are not shareable? Why is it that you choose to get immortal when you find what it is about you that is most shareable? what does this have to do with the physics of the telomere itself in DNA? The actual Eros Thanatos principle from Carl Jung. What does the urge to death have to do with this? The theory would be that if you look inside and you consciously, or even worse, unconsciously, do not believe that you are creating a service, then inside, deeply inside, this flips a switch and your cells decide to die. This is Eros Thanatos in essence. Because what does service mean? Service means essentially that you're creating part of the shareable memory. Because see, this is the core principle of human DNA being implosive or phase conjugate. That at the core of DNA, there's this phase conjugate DNA, hydrogen, radio, perfect dodeca ratchet DNA. And all of biology is therefore a collectivizing electric field. This is why the more you evolve, the more you feel the feelings of other people. When 3,000 people die on 9/11, the whole gene pool feels it. Well, when millions of people die on another planet, like the Prism of Lyra, this propagates a wave where every species that's using DNA across the galaxy feels it instantly. So the point is that you need to know deeply inside what is your highest level of service, or your cells will make the decision that you need to die. So until you find out what is shareable about you, so you go inside deeply and say, what is my highest level of service? And highest level of service can be a very, very subtle thing. There are so many ways to serve. But this is what's meant by the inner smile. Functionally, until you can look inside at yourself and smile at yourself in the tantric mantakchya sense of the inner smile that enables the tantric pumping, that Kundalini isn't possible. And this is a question that we began the evening with. It was very high up on our list of questions tonight. Is love and bliss the same? I guess we're allowed to wax poetical because it's getting toward the end of the evening. But we're saying that love, long wave phi ratio, low phi, literally means to embed perfectly. Now, if field effects embed perfectly, they make a heart, a perfect Valentine. The physics seems to fit if you look at the center of the Holy Grail animation. So perfect embedding is love. And the reason another person cannot accept your love until they love themselves is simple physics. Because until they've discovered inside themselves where their service becomes perfected, if you add love to their life and they haven't discovered how to distribute their own charge, suddenly your love is going to make them less stable. Literally. I think Bob Drachek published the study that sending love to someone that's not ready to receive love is actually destructive. Why? Because you're adding inertia to a tornado that's already unstable. It's a very, we could wax poetic and philosophical about this whole thing. But this is why the inner discovery of soul purpose, which is to say your highest level of service, has so much to do with this possibility of being able to both send and receive love, which is to say perfect embedding. Now, in that sense, low phi, long wave phi ratio, love, as perfect embedding, relates to the concept of bliss because bliss is the biological implosion of charge. That's what it is, which is then information dense, charge dense, hence the beginning of sustainability. And love is the perfect embedding that leads to this charge acquisition. But love generally refers to the ability to embed your plasma aura in that of another person. Interestingly, this relates to the physics of the fact that why we say you only fall in love with pure intention. It's simple physics. It's a very bad idea to be in love with an aluminum building because the aluminum building is a very bad place to embed your plasma aura, because your plasma aura is going to bleed charge if you embed your plasma aura in an aluminum building. Do not fall in love with aluminum buildings, because embedding your plasma aura in that structure is going to cause your plasma aura to bleed charge. Not good. Well, in the same way, you don't want to fall in love with people without pure intention, because they haven't learned how to embed themselves in a shareable wave yet. This is why we say you only fall in love with pure intention, which is why ultimately, if you want someone to fall in love with you or vice versa, the first step is to radiate pure intention, a shareable wave, which is why, if you go on a date with some person and this person is mean to the waiter in the restaurant, chances are you don't want to fall in love with them, because they're actually not a shareable wave. So really meditating on the meaning of pure intention is very useful to understand the mechanics of being lovable in both sending and receiving. And remember, when with the heart coherence measure, we discovered internal phase coherence in the EKG was directly measuring pure intention. Truly, that literally, if you tell a lie, your heart coherence goes down. It's the sepstrum. I defined the origin of heart coherence by defining the physics of how this is measured by equation in the sepstrum, where I invented the concept of heart coherence in the literature on planet Earth, and the whole story is there at fractalfield.com/coherence. And the reason why the measurement of heart coherence is a lie detector is because, and remember, they actually used it to measure kinesiology. The lie detector is your muscle. Well, you don't even need to do muscle testing if you measure heart coherence, because your heart knows which wave is perfectly shareable. And a shareable wave is the very nature of biologic memory and survival memory. Look, DNA has been in the business of collecting survival memory for a billion years. What memories serve collective survival? You gather those memories which have an electrical pattern called perfected phase coherence. And phase coherence perfected is called fractal phase conjugation. The perfected form of compression is the perfected form of coherence. That's why one wave node in a hologram has information about the whole hologram, because compression there is perfect. So perfected coherence is phase conjugate or fractal. By definition, fractality is perfected compression. I simply added this slight new piece of information of what a fractal electric field is, called phase conjugate. Mathematicians already proved that perfected compression is always fractality. I added the information about what a fractal electric field is, and that then defines perfected coherence. So you see the relationship between thinking a thought that's shareable and surviving charge compression. Okay, Dan, could your new device be eventually compressed from a tube to a sound file? Well, actually, my new device, the Therify, is a sound file originally. If you go down to fractalfield.com/implosion sound, you can not only download the sound file, you can download the software called Secret Science to play your own sonic implosion. And that's the low frequencies we use in the plasma of the Therify. Now, the high frequency is a perfect conjugate in phase on the equation, but we don't release what all the high frequencies are. We have to keep some secrets. But the device is definitely a sound harmonic. And by the way, I will tell you that Secret Sound Implosion perfected binaural beat software is very powerful, and deal with it carefully, because what it does is, it's like when the Monroe Institute, Bob Monroe, his research director, I'm playing with my hair here because this video camera is an inverse mirror. It's like a phase conjugate mirror. When Bob Monroe, his research director, Dr. Ed Wilson, discovered golden ratio in binaural beat therapy, and he realized you play perfected golden ratio binaural beats, and the interference in the phone on liquids inside your bed drives you out of your head. So he realized it could be dangerous, and he's right. It could be dangerous because you have to be able to be centered in the tornado. But Ed Wilson at that time, then, because since he saw my work in golden ratio in the heart, he actually drove to my farm from the Monroe, and we made a film together. A very famous Dr. Ed Wilson on golden ratio binaural beats And the climax of that work is that software at fractalfield.com/implosion sound. And that's the actual harmonic series we use in the Therify and the other devices. It's the equation on the cover of my book. And, of course, what we're doing in the Therify, we take that and we mix it with sub-megahertz, etc., drive frequency, perfect phase conjugate cascade. And then we feed that into a bifilar Tesla coil for perfect phase relationship to conjugate at 500,000 volts into the noble gases chosen explicitly for maximum bioactive field. We know noble gases make bioactive field, but if you write the right noble gas, you get maximum bioactivity, etc. So, let's see, do we have any fun? Thank you for your positive feedback, Robert. It's after 10 o'clock. So theoretically now, this is the last half hour of our little course in which it's open discussion time. Questions and thoughts and feedback and anything you would like to talk about. Lisa, I'm praying on helping your friend. Powering prayer heals. Get her to pediatrician. Thank you, Wayne. Yes, the inner smile like the Montauk Chia approach. Yeah, Montauk Chia supposedly, well, he took my friend Corinna Muller, my Milan sponsor, to I think it was Bangkok, and they did the king cobra snake venom ritual, and she drank the blood of the king cobra, and she had the dreams of the ancient dragon queens with Montauk Chia from the actual juices of the snake in that ritual. It was very intense. We'll tell that story a little bit more, but it actually was a key to the history of the dragon blood. Was actually the dragon queen story came out of the rituals that Corinna did with Montauk Chia. And then Montauk Chia learned the darkroom retreat ritual, which is obviously is kind of like Kogi's. The mamas, they went in the darkroom and they had the explosion of clairvoyant melatonin from weeks in total darkness. And the Kogis did it, and then Ananda was teaching that work from Norway. We worked with him for years. And then Montauk Chia learned it from Ananda, and our Italian sponsors, Kudai and Claudio, learned the darkroom, did it powerfully in Thailand with Montauk Chia, and then so there's just sort of a long history of the story of the relationship. So, I know what I was going to say. Then my lady friend at the time from Berlin. That's what I was laughing about. She was so afraid that some light would come in the windows. It seemed like I was living with a vampire. And you see what these people do with the darkroom retreats, that if this is the way you get your bliss, then you have to continuously pursue this darkroom as a way to get your clairvoyance fired up. So, it seems like people were extreme in the darkroom retreat ritual. But there's a lesson there, which is that whatever the last form of maximum bliss process you had, you will unconsciously want to return to that form of bliss until you find the next thing that gives you even more spin density. For example, a young child is his first experience on the roller coaster. And on that roller coaster, the young child's eyes open wider than they've ever opened before. And now that child is going to dream and want to go back to that roller coaster again and again to get that intensity of experience until he finds his next form of bliss process. Why is biology programmed like that? Because biology is programmed to need bliss process. That's the point. And until you bring that child to the next experience to have an even greater form of bliss. I'm just going to get some honey. Just 1 second. 1 second. Yeah, my throat is my yeah. So that's why it's so essential that we learn how to bring a form of bliss process to kids. Okay, other questions here. How do you control the Kundalini experience? In my case, it can last a long time, weeks, but you cannot keep it going or recall it on demand? Well, Kundalini is a very deep and powerful process. I wrote extensively about Kundalini there at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. And I also recommend the advice of Jana Dixon and her website on Kundalini. One second. I'm going to get a link for you. I think it's called Biology of Kundalini. Yes. Biologyofkundalini.com. Jana Dixon has done a lot of nice work too on the real biomechanics. Let me put that link in here in terms of suggestion. But the short answer to this story, how do you control Kundalini, is high quality protein, yoga, good grounding, breath of fresh air, a spin dense air, water, and food. Actually, dense protein is good for Kundalini. And extreme grounding, like getting in the water often, getting in live water often, is even better. So grounding is the short answer to that question. And nutrition. You should know that Kundalini stresses the mineral to water bond in the body, so remineralization and hydration becomes super critical. And almost all of that is also true for Therify.net, that the plasma device, because you're accelerating all those processes, metabolic acceleration, just like Kundalini. In fact, Therify dramatically accelerates my Kundalini, so it's the same thing. So hydration and remineralization, these are essential. Example of dense protein, well, for vegetarians, I suppose it would be lentils and mung beans, things like that. For non-vegetarians, some, sushi, salmon, tuna kind of stuff would be good stuff, I would think. I have, for example, millet cooked in coconut milk, alkalinizing every morning, 5 kinds of nuts and hemp berries and goji berries, and no dairy, no sugar, and no meat. I do have some seafood occasionally. Let's see, I want to get the questions. Does practicing Tai Chi create a constructive, coherent field of frequency of the body? Can this be measured by your heart tuner? Well, it is a good breakfast. I can tell you this, that the new version of the heart tuner, which is going to be iThrive.com, and you'll see the intro to it at Heart's Ring. In fact, let me give you a link to the new version. The new version is explicitly, we've already used it successfully to document long-term effects in heart rate variability from the Therify plasma system, which is very much like having a Bliss experience. In fact, lots of people in the Therify plasma have Bliss experience, and that's an intro to the new version right there. But the point is, in the new version, you take out here it is. I have it. I just happen to have it handy here. Here's the chest strap, the polar. Yes, I do have it right. This is the chest strap around here. So with the new version, we're going to show this in the next class. And I'll actually bring up the iPhone as it's here, but I have it here. But it's going to take, I'll do it in the next class. But you hold your finger on the camera light and you look at your heart rate variability for the short term. But long-term measurement of heart rate variability, normally 8 hours in bed overnight, analyzed with this device here, and we got dramatic and significant long-term increases in base heart rate and heart rate variability from the Therify plasma. So we know it's a metabolic accelerator. We've proved it and measured it. And it's similar to Bliss experience. You have a long-term measurable effect in heart rate variability. So actually, yes, can this be measured by your heart device? Yes. And you will see more of that when you learn about long-term measurements of HRV. Remember, it used to be from the 2-hour BBC special, you go to a hospital and spend thousands of dollars to get an 8 and 12 and 24-hour analysis of your long-term heart rate variability, because it's a very wonderful thing to do. Now, $20 application, iOS, iPhone, long-term HRV measure. Because remember what Irving Dardick did, they had all these diseases that he just look at the heart rate variability map of your day, say, oh, well, let's see, this period, this period, this period, and more. And he would diagnose the HRV of your day and tell you at what times during your typical day you needed to do something different in order that your heart rate would not stall. Very good. And suddenly he was healing all these diseases. He was the chairman of the Olympic Medical Committee, very successful. It's so successful that it was almost illegal. But it was all just from diagnosing long-term graph of HRV. And this, it will be in our new application. And this is a wonderful way to look at bliss experience, because long-term metabolic acceleration and metabolic harmonic inclusiveness is a direct correlate to bliss experience, not just in brainwaves, but in the heart. Okay. Oh, Wayne is talking to Thomas. Okay. I just want to see if there's any questions I missed here. What would happen with a daily Therify session with a meditation ritual? We have found, when the Lakowski device, which Guy Oblensky is using a variant on that theme, high voltage sparks, very good. That's what Tesla did, and healed Marconi and others with a high voltage spark, harmonic inclusive square wave spark gap, the carbon arc kind of thing. But Lakowski's arc requires many minutes in half hour, longer term in the charge field. But broader spectral phase conjugation, which is what the Therify is, because we have the optical component precisely conjugate right down to the subsonic infrasound. So broader spectral phase conjugation is more powerful, more focused. The pine cones kiss noses more accurately. So in the Therify, we're finding 3 to 5 minute sessions are quite effective, actually. And typically, we have useful effects even just after 3 to 5 minute sessions. And then for certain things, we do that session for 2, 3, 4, 5 days in a row, and we've been successful in almost everything that's been tried so far. But this is new. Everyday use, I personally would find it too accelerating. I find that when your ears are ringing and you're kind of buzzing inside, it's literally you're carrying your bliss with you. And if you have lots of Kundalini already, in my view, you don't really need a trigger experience like the Therify. But if you're wishing to accelerate Kundalini, then Therify would be ideal. But probably you won't need it every day in the long run. Although I have to say that Paul, who is one of our builders, very leading the team there, he said that after working with it for many weeks, he said he missed it very much after he shipped them. So it's clear that you become like you enjoy and need and want that field. He became addicted to it. That's what he said. Okay, let's see if there's any more questions here. Can Valerie pick up different frequencies when she hears ringing in her ears, pertaining to different people calling? She believes yes, actually, and we work together on that sometimes. But that's a difficult thing. But yeah, she actually hears different frequencies. Remember, Bentoff measured the frequencies heard in the ear ringing of meditators and proved it was the natural resonance frequencies of the ventricle cavities of the brain, and actually developed that homunculus, that little man model there, which is a picture that we didn't even finish. But basically, what he said is the progression of the sound current. Remember, sound current is what Sangreal, Song in the Blood, is about, and this is Ancestor Memories. He mapped the progression of the sound current as literally an amperage current around the folds in a figure-8 motion on the surface of the brain. And he said that the sequence of parts of your body, like you're feeling like a lightning bolt go up your tailbone, come up your spine. But the sequence of the parts of the body that many people felt stimulated in Kundalini actually corresponded to the homunculus little man map on the folded surface of the brain, meaning that it could be all in your head. I mean, it could be, you're feeling a donut of intense amperage inside your head, and where that part of your head is wired to your body is where you're feeling it in your body. So is it a torus in your head, or is it your whole body? Well, it's both. And remember, when we get to the physics of magic later, that the angle you throw that donut of charge from your brain is indexed by the letters of Hebrew and Sanskrit. And when you throw those donuts, like the horse whisperer, and project them at a sequence of correct angles, and they conjugate implode. It's called casting a spell, and why the air pressure in the room can implode, and the ritual can blow the doors off. But we'll get to that more if we talk about the ritual in Ophanim. With ringing ears, how to have peak perception and discernment and tuning to improve communication, how to know who is calling and how to have a clear conversation. This is the right question. This is the shamanic discipline. It's called discernment and discrimination, and it's called Astral Hygiene 101. Astral Hygiene 101 is essential. In other words, you see those pictures in the Gene Houston film, for example, of the trance dance, and they're doing the Kundalini and inviting ancestors in. But the astral hygiene goes something like this. In a typical rave concert where people are doing drugs, etc., there is no discrimination and nothing to determine whether the plasma entities that are entering various people's bodies are good or bad, essentially. Whereas in the ancient ritual, you have the entire extended family village is in a circle, and the one shamanic practice in the center is having a trance ritual, and the entire village is there setting their intention, saying, we're not just going to have random ghosts invited into that body. No, no, no. We're setting up a boundary condition with our coherent intention, which is saying very specifically which entities we want to communicate with. This is just an introduction to Astral Hygiene 101. So this business of trance and trance state, which is done without astral hygiene, is actually very dangerous. And this is what, just to introduce the concept of astral hygiene is so important, that you know what part of your aura has holes in it and where you're more susceptible to astral entities and how to remove astral entities. And we should have done this more in the course yesterday on shamanic science, but just a simple example. How to remove astral entities 101. 3 different exercises. 1, if you kind of think there's sort of some plasma beings in your aura that are, getting a little maybe, but supposing you spent too much time in a bar and you knew there's a lot of plasma entities there, or you've been in an argument or whatever it was. So anytime you suspect there's entities in the aura, entities just means bubbles of plasma, and the parasitic ones tend to attach to the back, actually, because that's where the weakest spot is. But I'm just going to give you 3 different simple practical examples. There's lots of ways to approach this, but 3 practical suggestions. 1, you practice some serious deep breathing for a minute or 2 till you actually feel the tingle. And then just at the moment when you think you can't deep breathe any longer, after a minute or a couple of minutes, then you get underwater. Ideally, living water. But you get underwater, and you stay under there and hold your breath for a little while. And you're going to feel this charge propagate through your aura. And then you do that several times. That is a way to remove astral entities. Practice number 2. You visualize your... It's like the orgasmatron. I'm looking at questions. Oh. Practice number 2. You visualize your aura as a blue glowing cocoon. Close your eyes, visualize your aura as a blue glowing cocoon. And then you visualize a very fine-toothed comb going down through your aura, through this blue cocoon. And as you visualize your blue aura being combed out, taking out the tangles, anytime there's a astral implant or a plasma entity in your aura, that will show up in your inner vision as a little black or red blotch or blockage in the blue aura. And so you can literally, with your intent, set your intent, and powerfully comb out your aura with your inner vision. And you can cleanse your aura that way. Practice number 3 will come back to me in a moment. It seems to me there's a 3rd practice we had. Oh, yes. Practice number 3 would relate to Ken Page practices in multidimensional cellular healing, where someone is very relaxed, and then another person, it's this kind of hypnosis, and then they talk to this person, and they begin to speak to the plasma entities in the aura using muscle twitches, because muscle twitches actually are a way of communicating with plasma entities. This is the Ken Page work. And remember, when you're asking a ghost to leave, it's not about being a kick butt or a buster. It's more about loving them and providing them the implosive path to charge distribution. Because remember, a ghost is measurable by the place in the field where they create coldness, which is to say the plasma is imploding in the ghost. And so what a ghost needs, you, for example, the ghost needs you as a place to implode, accelerate their plasma to get them into that charge distribution. So the negotiations that Ken Page had with ghosts in other people's aura are very instructive in this regard. And we'll leave that story for another time. But you can actually have a conversation with the entities and discuss with them and actually explain to them why it's to their benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a win-win negotiation. Eden Grace, with ringing in the ears, how to have peak perception discernment. Yes, how to know. We just talked about that. Gwen says, can you wreck your adrenals after a Kundalini experience if you're not metal impaired and let the fight-flight response take load? Absolutely. Kundalini, there is definitely such a thing as too much Kundalini, and there is such a thing as too much plasma implosion. Even the Therapy, small doses is best. What happens is, if you stay in the implosion field too long, you begin to feel wired and shaky, and you begin to feel dehydrated. So what the saying is that when you hold your breath and you feel that lightning build, you absolutely stay in the lightning center only until your inner voice says you're done for now. And then what you do is you relax and you do your hygiene and your good diet and do your yoga and for a couple of days until you've processed. The same way with the Therapy, the plasma imploder, you may perhaps do live blood cell microscopy and you do a liver flush, you do a cleansing basically, because anytime you enter implosion, the toxins emerge in your blood and your body needs to process them. So if you don't give yourself time to process, if Kundalini happens too rapidly, it is absolutely dangerous. And any spiritual counselor can tell you that, yes. And wrecking your adrenals, it's true. I think I overburnt some of my glands in too many years of intense Kundalini. And I have to do very careful nutrition to deal with the fact that my glands sometimes get very overexcited. And I'm hypersensitive to sound. I'm hypersensitive to electrosmog. I'm hypersensitive to a lot of things. And you just deal with it. But once you learn the hygiene, the lifestyle, and choose to live in a place like we're in the mountains here, where you get the kind of peacefulness you need. So you have to deal with it. Yes, Kevin says join the club. Lisa says lovely Bliss. Yes. Well, yeah, so it's been a good party. Thank you, everybody. I hope I didn't share too much of my own little melodrama. The idea was to teach a pure principle. Thank you, Thomas. We had a wonderful evening. Stories to tell. So upcoming conferences, we have one on the heart biofeedback and the new heart tuner, which is the iOS, and the real meaning of heart coherence. That's coming up. And then we have a session on the actual yoga and hygiene coming up. And then we have coming up the ET origins of DNA. We've got wonderful and fun classes coming up. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your questions. And Jane says, love the pure principle. Thank you. Blessings, blessings. And this film we will put up at the top of the same link, fractalfield.com/conjugate perception in one day. Thank you. Blessings, blessings. Thank you, Dan. Good night, everybody. See you. Bye-bye.